Hello and welcome to the 50th New Directors, New Films, presented by Film at Lincoln Center and the Museum of Modern Art. My name is Tyler Wilson. I'm an assistant programmer from FLC, as well as one of the members of the festival's selection committee. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion about Aleph, directed by Iva Radivojević. Iva, hi, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. Maybe considering how itinerant your film is, maybe it makes sense to tell the listeners and viewers where you're calling from at the moment.
I'm calling from Greece. I'm on the island of Lesbos, in a village called Erissos.
And you're maybe planning to come for the physical screening. I hope I don't jinx it, but yeah, that would be fantastic too.
Yeah, I'll be there.
But yeah, maybe a natural starting point for this conversation would be the starting point for the film, which is Borges and particularly his story, the Aleph, that your film pretty freely adapts or takes as its inspiration. So maybe to begin, could you talk a little bit about your relationship to this text specifically, Borges in general, and how his story formed the foundation for this film?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you so much for screening the film. It's an honor to be part of the New Directors, New Films, one of my favorite programs. Aleph, yes. Well, I should say that I sort of came up with an idea to do this sort of fragmented pieces that sort of coalesce into a whole, but I didn't really have a foundation from which to sort of build the ship. And one day my friend Rodrigo Reyes, who's a brilliant filmmaker, was in town, and I was just sort of catching up, and he was asking me what I was up to. And so I told him what I was thinking of making. And he kind of started talking about, microcosms and the universe, and sort of a kind of very cosmic. And he brought up Borges as I was telling him my idea. And he said, there's a story by Borges called Aleph that really reminds me about what it is that you're talking about. And I think you should read it. I think you should read that. And I think that you should watch Buñuel's Phantom of Liberty. So I took this kind of as a challenge, or sort of an exercise. It's like when somebody gives you ingredients and you have to make something out of it. And so I went and I read Aleph, and I was immediately intrigued. And that was my sort of first encounter with the story. And of course, in the story, for those who don't know, there's a protagonist, one of which is Borges, that discovers in his basement an iridescent sphere. So you kind of have to lie at a very specific position in the basement and look at it from a specific angle, and you would see this sphere, or this portal. And in the portal, once you look through it, you can see the entire universe, the past, the present, the future, everything that ever existed is sort of contained in this portal. And, he sees the mountains of Egypt and his lover, and everything is sort of there. And I interpreted this spot to be kind of like a place of peace or contentment, because if everything is there, you don't need anything. And it seemed like a place of home also, which is a lot of what my work deals with, belonging and so on. And so I decided to go deeply into Borges' work, and discovered sort of his motives, labyrinths, mirrors. He's obsessed with tigers, all these different things. And I started to build a world from there. And I decided I had to sort of come up with a shape that the film would take, whether it's a cone or whether it's a rectangle, some kind of a procession of things. And I came up with a circular labyrinth to be in the sort of world of Borges. So then in my mind, we would, as you do when you enter a labyrinth and you kind of have to find your way, sort of like solving a puzzle until you get to the very end and you exit. in my mind, we were looking for Aleph. We were looking for this portal, this point of contentment, let's say. So the labyrinth we would enter the labyrinth in Argentina, which is the land of Borges. And then in there, we would find these people who would give us clues as to how to get to Aleph. And of course, Aleph, is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet of many alphabets. And it's it kind of has different, in Jewish mysticism, connotations. And so it also looks like a man that's pointing both to the sky and to the earth. And it's kind of like one is mirroring the other. So it has all these different spiritual connotations. And so that was the sort of basis of the story. So this device is kind of game in which we enter the labyrinth and then we're guided through to the end of the labyrinth by this protagonist that we meet along the way. So that was the genesis. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the things your film does pretty powerfully, at least for me, is conjure this sense of being lost in each of these locations, and like of being in an unknown place, but also excited and curious about not knowing what might happen next from one cut to the other. And I mean, so maybe before we actually touch on the editing and like the form of the film, I'm curious to hear you say a bit more about what happens to you in each of these locations, or what happened to you. And I know that's a huge question considering the number of places you do explore, but I guess to start, I mean, you touched on what brought you to Argentina at first, but maybe you can tell us a bit more about how these encounters with each character that you tend to focus on plays out, how that started, and sort of generally what was your process once you arrived in a particular location.
Yeah, so again, I gave myself sort of a set of rules that I would have to follow. And I said, okay, I'm going to start in Argentina, and I have 1 month to find a story and to find a protagonist and somebody to perform that story, and of course to film it. So, and that was true for each place. So once I came to Argentina, I gathered stories from 4 different women. And I guess that was something that was echoing my own feelings at the time, which was one of the women particularly was feeling a little bit numb. She couldn't sort of feel, which is something that was very interesting to me at that time. And it was a good sort of inciting thing that would drive the narrative, right? Search for some kind of a meaning or feeling. And so I combined the stories from these 4 women and I wrote a character. And then I found one of the women actually performs that character. And then the way that I was going to find out where I go next is, I mean, everything is driven by the dream logic, right? We're in dream space. So one of the women had a dream that she sailed to the coast of Algeria. And there, as she was sort of getting off the boat, there was a man who had something to tell her. And so obviously my next prompt was, I have to go to Algeria. I have to find a man of this certain age that she dreamt about, and he will have something to say. And of course, in Algeria, we go and then we search for, we actually traveled all over Algeria. It was, again, about a month. And we interviewed men from specific ages, again, collected stories, again, wrote it to a character, and then found somebody to perform the character. And then we would kind of like tweak that character to the person who is performing, so you can feel more comfortable with it. But that's doesn't always say the same. So for example, in New York, Jarko, who is the actor in the 3rd segment, it's actually his own story. And it's something that had happened to him. He had also written a book about it. So it was quite protective of his story, and we worked together to sort of figure out how that will play out. So each segment was a little bit different, but the parameters where I would go, I would have a month, and I would look for stories and find somebody to perform them.
So the film was shot sequentially in the order in which you put it together.
Yeah.
Could you so I'm curious if could you speak a little bit more about how you found the particular styles of each sequence, because I think they are particularly unique, and I would imagine that they are a reflection of how you felt about the particular protagonist or collaborator that you had. For example, like the opening sequence is very like stream of consciousness. It's very written, and certainly calls to mind the Borges stories, especially about this person who's lost all feeling, because it did remind me of the story in which, after that character experiences the Aleph, he goes out into the world and like he's a bit numb because he's experienced everything and everything possible. So yeah, I'm just imagining you like, or wondering if these particular, or how you found these particular styles, if it was sort of trial and error, or if they actually emerged really naturally as you were researching each area.
Yeah, I would say they emerged naturally. For each segment, I would sort of bring a bunch of books with me, and I would do a lot of research for each country in terms of art, in terms of literature, in terms of music, and I would also bring some sort of poetry books, and then somehow from all of that information, I would come up with something that made sense. For example, in Algeria, when he's sort of walking through that maze and he's talking about his likes and dislikes, it's something that I took from Roland Barthes. He had a sort of a small piece that he wrote of his likes and dislikes, and they're very, very specific. I like strawberries. I like, walks by the sea. I like sati. I don't like women in pants, and so on. And so I took that approach and I sort of assigned it to the character in Algeria as a sort of a very direct way in, And this was true for each segment. In New York, the encounter that we see in the diner is a little bit similar to the encounter that I had with Jarko when I first met him. So it's almost me and him having our first conversation in a way. And things start to echo, coffee and cigarettes when they're sitting in a diner talking to each other. So things just started to make sense as I was in it, and ideas would pop up. And I think like when you're in that kind of creative space, it's very generative. So yeah.
Could you talk a bit about the conditions of each of these shoots? I'm wondering specifically if, what actually was the crew size? Was it just you? Did you have others around you behind the camera? And was that always consistent from place to place?
Yeah, no, very, very inconsistent. Money was also always sort of an issue, so we have to adjust to that. In Argentina, when we did the first shoot, we had very little money, and I went and I sort of filmed a lot of different things that I was experiencing, locations. So a lot of that stuff is in the film that I shot. And then once I had a story and I had the protagonist and the person who was going to perform, my cinematographer Jimmy flew down and we filmed all the sequences with the protagonist. So that's one. In Algeria, it was again, we found a story, we found a protagonist. I didn't shoot much. I shot, but it's not in the film. And then Jimmy came and we shot everything together. In Greece, for example, I shot the entire sequence. In the sequence with the eyes, I shot the entire sequence, partly because, again, these are spaces where maybe one man can't go, the monastery, partly because of financial issues and so on. So yeah, and Nepal was also similar to Argentina. I filmed a lot of the exteriors and locations, and then Jimmy came and we shot the parts with the character.
I guess, well, I certainly one of the elements that's shared across all of the locations is that of the narrator, who's voiced by the great poet Anne Waldman. Curious if you always had a narrator in mind for this type of film, and how that voice came into the picture, how you understood that voice as you were thinking about the film and shooting the film, and particularly how did Anne become that voice?
Yeah, there was always going to be a narrator, and that narrator is kind of the dreamer who devised everything, almost like a spiritual being that exists outside of space and time. It's kind of like pulling all the strings or leading you along. I didn't know how much it would be in the film from the beginning, but yeah, they were always going to be there, because it's also something that kind of appears through Borges's work, this kind of Atman, spiritual being that's sort of pulling the strings, you know. And then, yeah, we were lucky enough that Anne agreed to do this, and I thought that yeah, she had a spirit of what we were looking for.
Well, I would like to move on to the editing stage of this film, which I'd imagine was a gargantuan task for you. I mean, you know, we've been discussing the polyphonic form with many different people and different voices and languages, especially the film doesn't really follow like a particular plot as much as you know, a collection of experiences or a mood or a texture that you mentioned, an atmosphere, and yeah, you've already alluded to this this kind of like exquisite corpse logic that the film has, where one sequence ends on a note, a symbol, an idea that takes us to the next one. So yeah, I'm just wondering if you could walk us through your editing process a little bit more, and how were you sort of editing this film in your mind as you were making it, or really just if you can tell us how you made sense of all of these different places and people once you'd amassed, you know, all of this material.
Yeah, I also just want to go back to a previous question, just to say that we had, besides Jimmy and I, we had incredible crews, where we did have crews of everybody was local. We always hired local crews, and they were really, really incredible people. So they also guided very much the process of making and of writing, and therefore of editing as well. And so in order for me to proceed with the story, I had to kind of edit as I went. So I edited the first sequence, edited the second sequence, and then, you know, they kind of had to make sense first before I could move on. So editing was happening as I was filming. Some changes were made. I you know, at some point I did get kind of stuck, and I had a consulting editor, Jorge Luis, and I had an editor who came on later on, my good friend Sarah, who came on for a couple of weeks and started to sort of put a little bit more magic into the edit. But it wasn't as you know, scary as you would think. I think that yeah, I don't know, even in the past I was making these short films. I would make these films once a week, and I became very fast at coming up with so I kind of had that as a background, and it was easy to compile things. But of course, once everything was in the timeline, they had to, the biggest hurdle was to write the voiceover for the narrator, and also to start to break from the initial idea. So we started using these kind of footnotes, right? Like the Arctic section becomes a footnote. It's a story within a story, And Borges uses footnotes, and Breton uses footnotes in Naja, for example, where you're kind of like reading the main story and then you segue into the footnote and suddenly you're in a completely different story, So it was kind of going to be this labyrinthine, whatever, structure. So that those final touches kind of happened in the edit, and we started to seep in different characters, so to reoccur, like the Desire from the South African section would appear in Nepal, drinking tea on the screen, So little sort of things that we came up in the edit that would enhance the experience.
I think I only have time for one more question, but I kind of want to touch on what you mentioned just now of breaking from your initial idea, because I feel like what we maybe failed to touch on so far is actually how long this shoot took for you, because if we're taking the first sequence as any kind of evidence, the main protagonist is references the 2016 Trump election, the situation in Syria. So obviously a lot has happened between then and now. So yeah, I'm curious when the shooting finished, how long that took in general, and yeah, and then when the edit really started happening, and how the conditions of the editing stage maybe changed the meaning of the film for you, if at all.
Yeah, it took a really long time, partly because to convince funders to fund something that is based on dream logic, that you don't know where you're going, you don't know who your protagonists are, you don't know really what the story is tricky. And so, for example, between the first shoot in Argentina and the second shoot in Algeria, there was a gap of 1 year because we were waiting to raise that money. So, and then, eventually, as you sort of start to show the work, money starts to come in. But the final shoot happened in New York. My God, what year are we in? 2021, 2019. Was it? I think it was 2019. And then sort of a lot of the film had been edited already by that time. And that was the ending that we were sort of trying to finish. But then that whole thing fell apart. The ending fell apart, and so the new ending that you see is something that was generated as part of the editing process. We completely went away from what we were trying to do and came up with this portal and this sort of animated, Aleph.
So the editing sort of the final stage of this edit that you're referring to, that was like around 2019 or so?
So the final editing was done actually together with the VFX, and everything was done in 2020. We finished probably by summer or so of 2020. And then sound we did in Greece in August, because all the sound houses in New York were closed because of COVID. So we came to Greece and we did the post-production here, color and sound, and essentially that's when it was finished, close to fall of 2020.
Yeah, I guess I'm just asking or prying because I think it's inevitable given the conditions that we've been living under the past year, that I mean, I certainly responded to this film certainly in a way that I would not have in 2019 or something, and again, I think back to the Borges story where at one point, I forget which character is mentions how travel has become superfluous even back then, with the existence of the technology, and this film hits that note in a very unique way now that we're we're prevented from travel in an even larger way. And yeah, it just seems like this film is so special to watch now, because it seems like a very difficult type of cinema to return to, at least yet. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Hopefully it gives some expansion. That's what.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, Eva, thank you for sharing your film with us. It's a pleasure to have it in the lineup. Yeah, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for showing the film. I'm happy.